Some secrets don't disappear with time. They simply sink deeper, waiting for the right breeze, the right touch, the right memory to stir them back to life. Today's story begins with a silence too heavy to ignore, and a letter never meant to be found. What happens when the past starts whispering through the cracks of the present? And once you step onto the edge of truth, is turning back even possible? No one in the moss-draped village of Elmridge Green spoke often of Edith Hemsley, yet her presence lingered like the echo of a hymn sung too many times in an empty chapel, subtle, enduring, and strangely mournful. She had never been one for gossip or tea-table chatter, never married, and rarely smiled unless the corners of her mouth betrayed a flicker of something unreadable. And yet she became a legend in her own right, not because of affection, but because of the strange, solemn aura that clung to her like wood smoke to wool. For over 40 years she worked quietly behind the thick stone walls of Thornwick Manor, cooking for 3 successive generations of Rathmores, her handwriting cataloguing centuries of heirloom dishes, some believed lost to time, others suspected of darker folkloric origins whispered by housemaids behind half-closed scullery doors. She remembered everything: births, storms, broken clocks, the way certain footsteps sounded at different hours, and she forgot nothing, not even the name of the boy who vanished on Midsummer Eve in 1932, a mystery the village still half denied. Her death came without warning, in the ink-black hush between midnight and dawn. It was Agnes Crowley, the gardener's shy niece, who found her the next morning, seated perfectly upright in her chair beside the fireplace, her slippers aligned with unnatural precision, a cracked teacup resting beside her hand, and a half-burnt taper still glowing at the wick. Her expression was neither peaceful nor pained, just blank, as if she had finally turned a page she'd been holding for too long. No one heard a cry, no one noticed a light, the house had been silent, yet something in the air felt disturbed, like dust from a book long sealed. At her funeral, held 3 days later, under a sky too blue for the occasion, hymns floated across the gravestones like breath on a mirror, and her name was spoken only in cautious kindness. Edith was precise, Mrs. Ellaby offered, as if searching for a safer word than odd, a quiet creature, yes, but sharp in the way cold steel is sharp. As the village summer fair returned to routine, bunting strung with weathered string, sponge cakes judged, and lawn games resumed, her belongings were laid out for auction beside rusted gardening tools and tarnished spoons. Few noticed the leather-bound volume, wrapped in sun-faded red ribbon, resting at the far end of the table. It seemed heavy for its size, as though it carried not recipes, but recollections too dense to name. Miss Althea Gray, the village's solitary schoolmistress with a habit of watching rather than speaking, felt inexplicably drawn to it. She untied the ribbon with deliberate fingers, the scent of nutmeg and something older, perhaps myrrh or dry roses, wafting gently upward. The pages were thick, aged, and filled with handwriting so fine it resembled threadwork. Marrow stew, she read aloud, pickled quince, lavender scones, each with footnotes written in Latin, Greek, or what looked like archaic symbols barely decipherable. But it was near the final section, marked only with a pressed black feather and the year 1925, that she found something strange, a folded note, penciled rather than inked, and worn at the creases as if reopened many times with shaking hands. The recipe it contained listed no title, only components: hemlock root finely ground, powdered sugar sifted thrice, the hair of the betrayer sealed in linen, and a single line beneath, so faint it might have been written by breath alone: serve warm, speak no name, return by dusk. A chill slithered down her spine. She looked up, the laughter of the children at the nearby jam stall sounding suddenly distant, warped by a hum beneath the earth. The air around her pulsed, not with breeze but with warning. She placed the book in her satchel and stood slowly, her eyes scanning the crowd, though she searched not for a face but a feeling, one she couldn't quite name, but knew had been waiting. There, under the crooked branches of the hawthorn tree where the shade clung longer than it should, the story of Edith Hemsley had only just begun, though the village in its blind comfort believed it had ended. Dunslow Hollow had always guarded its secrets the way an old diary might hold memories, not written but buried, never meant to be read. Even today, as the harvest fete burst into colourful life across the vicarage garden, with bright bunting fluttering like kites in the wind, sponge cake competitions underway, and laughter swirling in the summer air, there was something beneath it all that felt. The sunlight was unusually soft, the breeze carried an eerie stillness, as if something wanted to speak but remained silent, afraid of its own truth. Tucked in the corner near an old weathered bench, Eleanor Finch sat quietly with a worn-out recipe book in her lap. The way her fingers clutched it, it looked less like a collection of ingredients and more like an unhealed wound. Its cover was frayed, the pages slightly stuck together as if time itself had tried to keep them from being torn apart. And then between the pages, something slipped free, an old note, scrawled in faint pencil. The words were faded, but they struck like a whisper to the chest. Forgive me, it was never meant for her. No name, no date, no signature, just one line that hung in the air like the ghostly hiss of an old teapot, silent, yet impossible to ignore. At first, Eleanor read it with mild curiosity, but the more her eyes traced those words, the more the color drained from her face, her breathing quickened. This wasn't something scribbled absent-mindedly by a housemaid or forgotten cook. These were words written by someone who either wasn't used to telling the truth, or someone who had suffered so deeply, even the act of writing it had left their hands trembling. Across the fete, Miss Adeline Gray sat serenely beside the lace stall, her smile as soft as her shawl, but her eyes sharp with a lifetime's worth of observation. She noticed Eleanor's distress instantly. Found something odd, she asked, her voice as light as silk, yet laced with the quiet understanding only a woman who had spent her life listening to unspoken things could possess. Eleanor forced a small smile. Oh, nothing. Just some scribbles in the margins. A cook's forgetfulness, perhaps. But the smile faltered too quickly, and Adeline noted the tremor still alive in her hands. The sounds of the village slowly returned to normal. Mrs. Linton continued boasting about her gooseberry jam. The Reverend struggled to secure bunting that kept falling, but among the familiar crowd that returned year after year, an invisible tension was beginning to coil. Clarissa Thornhill, standing near the lemonade stall, suddenly went pale when someone mentioned the note. Her smile arrived too quickly, as though rehearsed, like a defense mechanism. Dr. Penrose, buried in his Tumblr ledger, looked up with a flicker in his eyes, like an old memory had just clawed its way to the surface. And then the vicar's daughter, ever innocent, forever unaware, blurted her words without a second thought. I saw that strange note in the recipe book, never meant for her. Maybe it was just a shopping list, she said, casually biting into a slice of Victoria sponge, as if the line were nothing more than a forgotten ingredient. But the silence that followed wasn't small. Mrs. Albridge's spoon froze mid-air. Miss Lavinia, who had survived 2 wars and 3 scandals, lowered her parasol and said softly, "That kitchen always felt cold after dark." That one sentence shifted the entire atmosphere. Conversations turned into whispers. Behind the jam stalls, at the edge of cake slices, the same question circled like a moth to flame. Who wrote the note? Clarissa's fingers were clenched now, as if holding on to something invisible, perhaps a memory, or maybe guilt. No one mentioned the girl who once worked at the manor by her side, nor the younger sister whose name had quietly vanished from conversation years ago. Miss Gray, who had learned that truth rarely screams, it simmers, clutched her handkerchief a little tighter and murmured, "Secrets don't die with time, they just boil underneath." And as the fete continued dressed in its hollow happiness, the old recipe book now zipped inside Eleanor's satchel no longer carried just flour and sugar stains. It held a story, one that was still alive, clawing to be heard. Beneath the shadow of the church bell, time stirred restlessly, and a new truth began to open its eyes in Dunslow Hollow. Just imagine a village where every street, every stone, every crumbling wall hides a secret, and that village was called Briarwell, a place where time hadn't stopped exactly, but perhaps had gone into hiding, beneath old bells, behind faded bunting, and in those smiling faces whose eyes never quite smiled with them. It was the day of the grandest festival of the year, the Founders' Gathering, where the entire village came together, pastel tents were pitched, and old melodies echoed to celebrate heritage and memory. But something was different that year. There was a strange chill in the air, like an old story waiting to be told again. Evelyn Harrow, a quiet, wise woman wrapped in an aged shawl, stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching what looked like an ordinary recipe book, but it was more of a forgotten ledger of memories. It held parish contributions, small church bills, birth and death entries, but at the very last page she found something that made her hands tremble slightly. Wrapped in brittle wax paper was a small envelope, just 3 words written on it. For Clara, forgive me. Inside was an old silver charm in the shape of a tiny cage. Beneath it, folded, was a yellowed note, its ink faded but the words still loud. I didn't mean for the door to lock, I thought she'd find the key. No signature, no date, just a confession trembling on torn paper. For Evelyn, it wasn't just some old paper, it was a voice, long buried and now trying to rise. That very evening, as the villagers were packing up their stalls, Mrs. Tilling, the elderly caretaker of the antiquarian booth, casually said something that dropped like a stone in still water. The attic windows of Braybrook Manor were open this morning, after years. Her words cast a long shadow. The manor, the last place Clara had been seen on the night of that same founders' ball when the whole village was aglow. Clara, with that same silver charm around her waist. The manor had been locked from the inside, the windows shut tight, yet Clara had vanished from the house, from the village, as if no one had dared to search for her at all. People had learned to stay silent, or perhaps to hide. Evelyn sensed something more than grief in their silence. She sensed fear, that kind of fear that comes from secrets finally catching up. When the charm was shown, Margaret Bloom, the seamstress who had sewn Clara's christening gown, dropped her stitching, her eyes welling with a sorrow far too old to be fresh. No one spoke, but everything was suddenly said. That night, while the village slept and wore its mask of normalcy once again, Evelyn quietly made her way to Braybrook Manor. The air hummed strangely, like old memories returning, barefoot on moss and gravel. The ivy had curled tightly around the front gate, like it was hugging the house into silence. Inside, the air tasted of brass and old dust, and cobwebs swung like chandeliers from another century. She made her way to the attic, where sunbeams filtered through in thin lines. In one corner behind a crumbling cabinet she found a loose panel, partially ajar. Inside was a narrow crawl space, just big enough for a child to squeeze through. Lavender lingered in the air, and a small diary lay there, titled Clara's Hours. The pages were filled with a little girl's handwriting, simple games, small dreams, and on the last page just one chilling sentence: "Someone watches me at night. I think it's her." Evelyn's heart sank. Her? Who was she? Suddenly, footsteps echoed from below. Someone was in the house. Evelyn slipped the diary inside her coat and carefully began to descend. In the drawing room, a shadow moved in the corner, a tall woman, her face hidden in the dark, but her eyes glowing faintly, as if from another time. She said only one thing: "You were never meant to find this." Evelyn asked, "Then why leave the trail?" The woman smiled slowly and replied, "Because Clara never left. She just stopped being seen." Just then the old grandfather clock struck from deep within the manor, a chime for every heartbeat of the buried secret. Outside, the church bell echoed in response. Evelyn knew now this wasn't just an old story. It was a calling, and this time someone had finally started to answer. The knock came just after 4:30, soft yet oddly insistent, as though the one behind it wasn't entirely sure they wanted to be answered. Miriam Dorsey hesitated before unhooking the latch. She hadn't been expecting anyone, certainly not on a day like this. Grey and heavy, with the kind of stillness that made clocks sound louder than they should. The woman at the door was a stranger, though her face held something eerily familiar, like a name you almost remember in a dream. She introduced herself as Lydia Vale, said she was passing through, researching old properties, particularly the ones with sealed wells and burned blueprints. "You have one of the few homes that survived the 1894 fire," she added, eyes not quite meeting Miriam's. A brief pause, a glance behind her, and Miriam stepped aside, as if something deeper than courtesy compelled her to let the woman in. The conversation inside lasted no more than 10 minutes. Books were mentioned, lost documents, and a ledger Lydia said had once belonged to a healer named Cressida Hawke. But when Lydia left, Miriam's hands were trembling, her teacup untouched, the small brass bell on the mantel vibrating faintly, though no one had walked past it. That evening, at Mrs. Hemsley's weekly gathering, the subject of the old town pharmacy came up, half demolished now, but supposedly once a haven for women who needed quiet remedies. When someone joked about ghost recipes tucked in family cookbooks, Miriam, usually composed, knocked over her tea with an audible crash. "Just the wind," she muttered, though no breeze stirred the lace curtains. Across the room, Edith Lorne, who had once boarded in that very pharmacy as a girl, went still as stone, her gaze fixed on the fireplace like it had whispered something only she could hear. No one pressed her. They rarely did. The next morning, as mist crept low across the hedgerows, Miriam walked to the edge of Ashbrook Lane, where the oldest trees stood like watchers. A path used only by deer wound into a thicket, and behind it, she had always known but never dared look closely, lay the sealed stone ring of a forgotten well, its lid etched with faint symbols and lichen-covered initials. Something compelled her forward. A faded ribbon was tied around a nearby sapling, and beneath it, buried in damp moss, she found a page, thin, brittle, and smelling of camphor. The ink was blurred but legible. She took what wasn't hers, but the well took her voice instead. The silence is the key. That night, just past midnight, Miriam lit every candle in the house and listened, really listened, to the creaks and sighs of her home. In the old sitting room, the fire flared without reason, and when she turned toward the mirror above the hearth, there, reflected not in glass but in shadow, stood Lydia Vale again. Though her mouth did not move, her voice was inside Miriam's mind, a whisper threaded with sorrow and warning. Some things survive fire not by chance but because they were never meant to leave. The day Imogen Hale was laid to rest, Thornwick Hollow seemed to exhale, not in peace but in uneasy silence, as if something had been watching and waiting, and now stirred beneath the surface. Hers had been a quiet death, or so it was said, but no one in the village truly believed in quiet endings anymore, not after what had happened in 23, and certainly not with the chapel bell cracking on the morning of her burial. Miss Adelaide Marrow, who had lived alone ever since returning from France after the war, told the grocer's boy that she'd heard 3 knocks at her back door that same night, slow, deliberate, and when she opened it, there was nothing there but a withered sprig of hemlock tied with a red ribbon. Most dismissed it as imagination, until the envelope appeared on the altar at St. Jude's 2 days later, unmarked except for a seal no one recognized, a circle of thorns pressed into black wax. Inside, a folded scrap of parchment, yellowed and cracked at the corners, bearing 4 things: a Latin phrase fiat lux, a childlike map of the village drawn in red ink, a name no one had dared speak in decades, Agatha Voss, and an X drawn over the disused belfry near the schoolhouse. Miss Marple, visiting her cousin Eleanor due to a sprained ankle, noticed the commotion outside the post office and instinctively made inquiries, though she suspected something unusual long before the villagers did. For her, it was the timing, Imogen's death, the crack in the chapel bell, the letter, things buried, she murmured one evening while stirring her tea, have a dreadful habit of resurfacing when no one's prepared to look them in the eye. The second envelope came 3 nights later, tucked inside the hollow base of the angel statue in the cemetery. This time the contents were more disturbing, a photograph of a young girl standing in the schoolyard, her face scratched out with a sharp implement, and written on the back in the same crimson ink. She tried to tell, they made her forget. No one recognized the girl, except Miss Ellery, the former schoolmistress, who'd always been tight-lipped about the year Agatha vanished. Miss Marple visited her under the pretense of asking after old school registers. Miss Ellery's hands shook as she poured the tea, and when Miss Marple casually mentioned Agatha's name, the cup nearly slipped from her grasp. She was troubled, Ellery said, eyes distant, said she heard voices in the walls, drew pictures of doors that didn't exist. Her voice dropped. I told them she needed help, but help in those days meant silence. That same evening, someone broke the padlock on the chapel's west cellar, untouched since 1946, and left a 3rd envelope nailed to the cellar door. It contained a single torn page from a church ledger, dated November 1923, with half the entries smudged out except one name, underlined 3 times, Dillingham, Enoch, confession withheld. By now, Miss Marple was no longer simply visiting, she was investigating. She took the map from the first letter, laid it over a current drawing of the village, and saw what no one else had. Each envelope had been placed at points forming a rough pentagram, with the burnt-out watchtower as its center. She arrived at the base of the tower just after dawn, mist curling like breath from the earth, and began to dig with a trowel she'd borrowed under the guise of weeding Eleanor's rose beds. What she unearthed was not a box but a rusted biscuit tin wrapped in oilcloth, and inside, a lock of hair tied with silk thread, a broken rosary, and a letter addressed in a spidery script, for whoever finds me after the silence. She read it by firelight that night as the church bell tolled 6 times, the same number of names etched faintly inside the letter's margins. 6 names, 6 secrets, and beneath them, in ink dark as old blood, you buried us once, but stories like bones always rise. Miss Marple closed the letter slowly, folded her hands around her tea, and stared into the flickering hearth. The dead, it seemed, had decided it was time to speak again, and they had chosen her to listen. Some writings were never meant to be discovered, and some silences were never meant to last a lifetime, but the dust never forgets, and the walls remember everything. The brittle paper Miss Adelaide Ferncroft unfolded that morning had no title, no author, no signature, only a date scrawled in a trembling hand. February 3rd, 1909, and below it, a single sentence that seemed to shiver as she read it aloud. Wrong girl, wrong grief, confession pending. The words lingered in the quiet air of her sitting room like the breath of something that hadn't yet died. She hadn't been to Greystone Estate in over 3 decades, not since the lake froze silently that terrible winter, and the dogs howled until morning like they were warning the living and mourning the dead, but she knew, instinctively, that some stories, no matter how deeply buried, clawed their way back. Memory, she believed, had roots deeper than trees and sharper than broken glass. Under the harmless pretense of returning a borrowed gardening almanac, she made her way to Mr. Whitcomb's archive room, tucked behind the vestry like a relic no one dared throw out. Mr. Whitcomb, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a habit of alphabetizing jam labels for fun, welcomed her with a cautious curiosity. "The estate," he murmured, running his fingers over the brittle spine of a forgotten registry. "It once employed 17 staff, and a nurse who disappeared one winter's night. Clara Montrose, I believe. She was never officially declared dead, just lost." Miss Ferncroft's voice was calm, almost idle. "Strange. I recall a drowning reported in the papers." Mr. Whitcomb shook his head slightly. "That's what they said. But the groundskeeper told my uncle she'd feared water. Refused to even cross the footbridge. That evening, the fire in her study snapped and hissed like it too was trying to speak. She opened the church newsletter again. The one she'd found hidden behind her aunt's old sewing drawer, the one no one had ever mentioned. It wasn't just the line written there, it was the weight behind it, the unspoken guilt bleeding through the ink. The next morning, veiled in fog, she walked up to Greystone under the guise of speaking with the groundskeeper, but instead stood beneath the western balcony where Clara was last seen, where her shadow had vanished like a thread pulled from a seam, and there, half buried beneath the ivy, she uncovered a brooch rusted nearly black with a velvet scrap still clinging like a memory that refused to rot. Later that day, while helping Mrs. Stroud, the late Reverend's widow, prepare labels for the harvest marmalades, she asked in a tone so light it could have drifted away with the wind, "Clara had a sister, didn't she?" Mrs. Stroud paused, her hand faltering over a jar of fig preserve. "Yes, Ruth, I believe, but she left, or so they say." Her voice dipped, but I sometimes wonder if it was the country that left her. In the vestry storage between hymnals and unstrung rosaries, Miss Ferncroft found an old household inventory tucked into the pages of a discarded prayer book. The ink had faded, but the implication had not. On a page marked January 27th, a servant's hand had recorded, "Nurse replaced, records delayed, evening disturbance in room 4, staff advised to refrain from inquiries." Beneath it, scribbled in hurried script, "The child sleepwalks but the mother hears things." That line echoed in her skull like footsteps in a locked corridor. That night her fireplace cast long, flickering shadows on the wall as she opened yet another diary, this one written not by a man of the cloth, but a woman of no title. "I saw her fall," it read, "but someone else pushed, and no one believes a maid, especially one who knows too much." Miss Ferncroft stared at the words, the fire reflecting in her eyes. This was no accident. This was no mystery solved by time. This was a silence enforced, and the people who had enforced it had passed down their version of the truth like an heirloom no one dared examine too closely. Some secrets, she thought, aren't buried. They're disguised as misfortunes, folded into the quiet pages of forgotten ledgers and sealed behind polite smiles. Clara's death was no tragedy. It was a substitution. Someone else was meant to fall. And if Miss Ferncroft was right, then the true reason for it all wasn't just buried, it was protected. And now, after all these years, the past wasn't returning for justice. It was returning for reckoning. It had been nearly 35 years since anyone had dared mention the Gresham Hollow fire in anything louder than a whisper or anything firmer than folklore, but even silence leaves behind ash, and this time the smoke had begun to rise again. It started quietly, as such things often do. A ledger misplaced in the vestry archive, its spine scorched, the ink inside warped by moisture and time. Miss Evangeline Harrow, now nearing 70 but still sharp as a frostbitten blade, found the book while searching for baptismal records no one had asked for in years. The entry was peculiar, not merely for the missing dates and ink blots that resembled fingerprints, but for what had been written sideways in the margins. The child survived. The truth did not. That night she could not sleep. Outside, the wind creaked through the bare branches like someone pacing in the attic, and from the cellar came the slow groan of old pipes or memories. Gresham Hollow had been considered cursed for generations, ever since the orphanage fire took 7 children and a governess whose name was deliberately excluded from the parish memorial. But Evangeline remembered her, Marjorie Pell, with her quiet voice and unnatural calm, the kind of woman who smiled only when someone wasn't looking. Some said she escaped, some said she never existed, but the note in the ledger suggested otherwise. The next morning, under the guise of researching for a fictional monograph, Miss Harrow paid a visit to the local records clerk, Mr. Alan Quince, a man who enjoyed riddles, provided they weren't his own. With gentle prodding and a cup of oversteeped lemon tea, he admitted that there had been a set of revised property documents filed that very spring, documents that reclassified the orphanage grounds as historical grave soil, a designation typically reserved for plague sites or unmarked wartime burials. "Strange that," he said, glancing over his glasses, "especially since no one's buried there. Not officially, anyway." Evangeline said nothing, but that night she walked the edge of the ruined estate under cover of moonlight, following a trail of broken garden tiles, until she reached the sunken remnants of what had once been the west wing, where the nursery was kept, and where, according to rumors, a child was found alive 2 days after the fire, covered in soot, eyes wide open but utterly silent. They had called her Lydia in the reports, though that was likely not her name. And what of her now? Who had she become? 2 weeks later, during a routine sorting of donations at the parish charity shop, a photograph slipped from the folds of a moth-eaten coat. In it, a little girl stared at the camera from the steps of the old Gresham building, her left hand holding a doll with no face. On the back was a note: "She remembers everything, but says nothing. She always did." It was signed MP. The initials struck her like thunder: Marjorie Pell, which meant the woman had survived, or someone had forged her signature to keep a lie alive. Either possibility was dreadful. As Evangeline dug deeper, names began to surface, familiar ones. Reverend Holt, who died in his sleep a week before the fire, but was later revealed to have made a large, uncharacteristic withdrawal from the church fund. Nurse Billings, who vanished the night after the tragedy and was later seen under a false name tending to the elderly in Dover. And now, even Mrs. Claremont, the town's oldest benefactor, who had always deflected any mention of her time as a housemaid in Gresham, had recently redrafted her will, leaving her entire estate to an anonymous trust registered under the name LD Foundation. Lydia, dead, disguised, still watching. Evangeline could feel it now, the pieces of a history not lost but deliberately obscured, turned sideways like the writing in the ledger, visible only if you tilted your head and asked the wrong questions politely. It all became real when the constable came knocking, not with a crime but with a death. Mr. Alan Quince had been found dead at his desk, a cup of tea beside him cold but untouched. The only strange thing, every document in his office had been rearranged in alphabetical order. Every one except the folder marked Gresham. It was missing. That night, the church bell rang at 3:17 a.m., a time no one could explain, for no one had pulled the rope. And standing at the edge of the churchyard, her coat buttoned to the throat, was a figure no one recognized, but whose face looked eerily like the girl from the photograph. She did not speak. She only stood there. And by morning, the air smelled faintly of ash. In the earliest hush of morning, a strange, sweet scent, like something burned, lavender perhaps, drifted through the mist that blanketed Hollowmere Lane, as if an old memory had crept quietly back from some forgotten corner of time. Nora Pembroke, who always woke at dawn to boil her egg precisely 6 minutes and sweep her stoop twice without fail, was the first to sense that something was off today. No birds sang, no dogs barked at the alley's edge. Everything was wrapped in a chilling silence, thick and unnatural. By midday, word had swept across the village. Miss Letty Morden, once a schoolteacher, now a reclusive shadow of herself, had been found unconscious in her drawing room. Every mirror in her home was shrouded in dark fabric, curtains drawn so tightly that the house seemed to inhale darkness, and the old mantel clock, usually the only sound in that lonely house, had stopped at precisely 3:12, as if time itself had refused to move forward. The doctor blamed stress or fainting, but Elspeth Rowe, the woman who brought Letty her Sunday paper and lemon biscuits, wasn't so sure. "This was staged," she whispered to the constable. "This didn't just happen." She pointed to an overturned footstool and the half-burned remains of a paper in the fireplace, still faintly smelling of old ink and scorched wood, not fully consumed, not fully hidden. But the true horror began when Letty came to, her voice trembling, repeating the same words over and over. It wasn't fire, it was a girl, the girl in the red shoes, as though she had not woken from a dream, but from the noose of a buried sin. 2 days later, Miss Wren, the village's elderly historian, unlocked the parish archives and uncovered a dusty file from 1897. In it, a name reappeared like a ghost's breath: Eleanor Morden, Letty's younger sister, long believed to have tragically drowned in the marshes as a child. Alongside it, she found an unsigned letter tucked among orphanage files, one no one remembered cataloguing. Letty had always said, "Pain in our family is a sealed envelope, you don't open it." But someone had torn that envelope open now, and its pieces were seeping like blood through the cracks beneath her floorboards. That same evening, Constable Dane discovered a broken iron lockbox hidden beneath the church pews. Only one item was missing: a photograph, faded, sepia, and deeply unsettling, of 2 little girls standing at an old garden gate. One wore a locket around her neck, the other was barefoot, without red shoes. When Miss Wren saw the image, she whispered, "But that gate fell in 1910, and her voice quivered like frost against the stone vestry wall. From that night on, something strange settled over the village. Reverend Alton's ledger disappeared. The church caretaker vanished without notice, and several claimed to see a woman in gloves walking near the old mill, leaving trails of smoke as she passed. There were no witnesses, no evidence, just the unmistakable feeling that the air itself had changed, as if someone had turned over the pages of time too far." Miss Wren, still standing by her bookshelf, eyes fixed on brittle parish records and yellowed newspapers, finally spoke just once, her voice barely above a whisper but enough to send a tremor through the church's old stone. "Perhaps we buried the wrong girl." As the golden leaves of Elmswood began to fall and the sky took on that late autumn pallor of ash and fire, a slow, silent dread seemed to settle over the village, not of any visible threat, but of something older, buried and beginning to stir. Mr. Gideon Hurst, once known for his reserved civility and precise manner, the man who polished his shoes even on Sundays and folded his handkerchief with military symmetry, had withdrawn into the skeletal hush of his ivy-covered cottage on Hollow Lane. For years he had walked to the post office every Thursday at 10 sharp, always with a quiet nod to Miss Tilling the florist and a courteous word to the milkman. But lately his patterns had unraveled. He was seen only fleetingly, sometimes peering from behind moth-eaten curtains, sometimes walking past the green in the hours before dawn, his face pale and wet with sweat despite the cold. Rumours whispered through teacups and over low hedges, strange flashes of light in his attic, the sharp scent of scorched paper drifting downwind, the haunting sound of a music box playing a broken lullaby. It was Mrs. Whitley, tending her dahlias near the back fence, who first noticed the open window one night, saw Mr. Hurst silhouetted against flickering candlelight, speaking as though to someone unseen. When questioned, he claimed he'd been cleaning out some old nonsense, but his eyes, usually cool and guarded, darted with something very near fear. Miss Oda Fenley, retired librarian and unofficial historian of Elmswood, could no longer ignore the itch in her memory. One rain-slick afternoon, she retrieved the sealed ledgers from her private cabinet, census sheets, orphan records, adoption listings. There, between the entries for 1902 and 1905, she found it, a brief note, tucked in with the name Gideon Harrow, an orphan placed with the Hurst household for less than a year. Next to it, scribbled in faded ink, removed, identity obscured by request. Disturbed by the phrasing, Ada pressed further, requesting access to the vestry archives, where a sealed envelope, marked in Reverend Cornwell's handwriting as "to be opened only if necessary," held an older document, a baptism record, partially water-damaged, but revealing nonetheless, Edwin G.H. born November 1895, mother Constance Hurst, father Bunewin. Beneath that, in a second-hand rougher ink, child will not be claimed, relocated per agreement, but relocated where and why? The questions deepened when the town bell rang 3 times at precisely 3:07 a.m., not once but 3 nights in succession, and each time villagers reported the same inexplicable sound, a child's laughter, faint but clear, echoing from the direction of the cemetery. Then came the cracked window at the church, the one that split clean down the center during a reading from Ecclesiastes, as if something divine, or perhaps forgotten, was disturbed by the words. And finally, Ada, drawn by instinct and unease, returned to her own home to find a parcel resting on her doorstep, wrapped in twine, the paper slightly damp. Inside, a sepia-toned photograph of 2 boys standing by a pond, one smiling, the other hollow-eyed, holding a rusted locket. The back read, in jagged childlike scrawl, "He said I didn't belong, but he buried the wrong one." That night, for the first time in nearly a decade, the lights in Mr. Hurst's cottage burned until dawn, but by morning he was gone. No footprints, no note, only the faint scent of wax and ash lingering in the hallway. And in the silence that followed, Elmswood remembered what it had long chosen to forget, that some names aren't lost, they're hidden, waiting for the right silence to speak again. The clouds over Rainwick Hollow that day were of an unusual shade, not quite black, not entirely pale, as if the sky itself was trying to conceal something it couldn't bear to speak aloud. The air was thick with a kind of tension that clung to the skin like a second layer, and the aging Whitmore Manor stood against the landscape like a forgotten sentence, unfinished, waiting for someone to speak the final word. Inside, in the drawing room heavy with silence, it felt as though the walls themselves had overheard things too terrible to repeat, secrets so dark they clung like soot to the lace curtains and dust-choked corners. Eleanor Whitmore, once a famed writer of quiet tragedies and half-whispered longings, had vanished 5 nights prior without a trace. No forced entry, no packed bags, no farewell, just an open window and the faint scent of old ink lingering in the air. What remained behind was a scattering of her belongings that now seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. Pressed flower cards wrapped in pale ribbon, notes half-finished in delicate handwriting, and one message written so softly it could barely be read. I tried to stop her, but I never told her why. It wasn't a confession, nor a declaration, it was a wound stitched shut with silence, a plea not meant to be read but to be understood. Alongside it, a photograph surfaced, Eleanor smiling beside an unknown woman near the edge of a fog-covered lake. But there was more. Reflected faintly in the rippling water behind them was the image of a third figure. No face, no presence ever recorded, and yet unmistakably there. Inspector Halloway, a pragmatic man who rarely entertained ghost stories or forgotten legends, had initially treated Eleanor's case as another unfortunate disappearance. But as he walked the length of the manor and reached the cellar, long sealed and locked, he found a weather-worn trunk with corroded hinges and a padlock that practically crumbled under pressure. Inside lay a collection of letters wrapped in oilcloth, all addressed to someone named E.V., dated 1913. Most were unreadable, the ink long faded, but one remained legible. If she remembers, everything ends. There was also a map tucked between the pages, not a geographical one, but a chart of something stranger, labeled rooms, shifting corridors, memory 1, the locked corridor, forget-me room, and at the center, she lives behind the third door. Halloway couldn't tell whether it was describing a building or a mind. The old caretaker, Mr. Bellamy, whose son had vanished 3 decades earlier in what was thought to be an unrelated tragedy, quietly confessed something he had never dared admit. The East Wing had been sealed not for renovation, but by order of Eleanor herself. "Too much noise in there," he said, voice trembling. "Sometimes at night I hear writing, not typing, not scribbling, but like dictation, like someone whispering to a hand that isn't theirs." The East Wing had remained untouched for years, but the rumors had never stopped. No one who had gone near it ever wanted to return. Miss Hale, a visiting librarian and self-proclaimed amateur historian, had been cataloguing Eleanor's literary archives when she found an unpublished journal, one filled with cryptic thoughts and entries that seemed more like riddles than recollections. One passage read, "Truth is not what happened, truth is what was buried to protect the ending." Beneath that, in another hand, not Eleanor's, was scrawled a chilling sentence: "I told her not to remember me, but she did." Who had written it? And why did the handwriting seem inconsistent, as if multiple minds had fought for control of the same hand? That night, a storm rose over Rainwick Hollow. Rain beat against the windows like fists trying to get in. Lightning split the sky and briefly illuminated the East Wing's locked hallway. Just after midnight, the power went out. Moments later, the sealed door, untouched for years, groaned open on its own. Inside, nothing but darkness, and then a voice. Cold, calm, disembodied. "You wrote me out, but stories don't forget." By morning, Eleanor returned, but not as she had been. She did not speak at first. She moved slowly, deliberately, as though listening to something just behind her shoulder. Her eyes were the same, but hollowed, darker, as if someone else was peering through. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, distant. "It was never my story," and in that moment, those gathered in the manor understood. The story hadn't ended, it had only been paused, waiting. Rainwick Hollow had always looked away from the truth, buried it in gardens and attics, in old letters and unspoken grief. But this time, the truth hadn't knocked. It had broken the door down. The fire crackled low in the ancient hearth of Renmore Hall, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to stretch and recoil against the panelled walls like memories trying to claw their way back into the present. The air hung heavy with something more than dust or age. It was a silence that pressed inward, thick and uneasy, the kind that rooms remember long after voices have ceased. Miss Isabel Grey, usually reserved and almost spectral in her manner, stood quietly by the hearth, her slender fingers grazing the edge of an old tarnished frame that held a photograph, its image fading but its story still seething beneath the surface. Her voice, when it finally broke the stillness, was low but unmistakably firm. "I would like," she said with restrained solemnity, "to speak of Helena Ashcroft." A pause followed, an unnatural stillness that wasn't simply about waiting. It was like the room itself was listening, wary of truths that had too long been buried beneath civility. "She didn't simply leave this house," Isabel continued, her gaze fixed on no one, and yet cutting through everyone. "She was erased." There was a subtle intake of breath from Lady Miriam, seated nearest to the piano, her gloved fingers curling against her skirts. Everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not, had heard whispers of Helena, the governess who vanished one December evening in 1922. Officially dismissed for personal indiscretions, Helena had left behind no letters, no farewell, no trace, only a locked room in the East Tower, and a chilling final entry in her diary that ended mid-sentence. "He said I would forget, but I remember the red door and what waits behind it." Isabel's voice softened but grew darker, like smoke curling through a narrow space. 3 days ago an envelope arrived, addressed in Helena's hand, postmarked from Dorset, dated last week. Murmurs rippled through the room. Inside was a single note, unsigned but unmistakably hers. It read, "I remember the locked room, do you?" Isabel let the words hang like a noose tightening with time. And with that note came something else. A key, brass, ornate, cold as ice, even hours after touching it. Lord Felix Ainsley had brought the key to her in secret, his hands trembling, his voice cracking as he confessed he'd dreamed of Helena for 7 nights straight, always standing at the top of the East Tower staircase, her back turned, her hands bleeding. He had hoped it was guilt, just guilt. But when they approached the sealed wing together, the boards covering the old door were not just loosened, they had splintered from within. No one had entered, but something had clearly come out. And then there were the footprints, bare, pale, wet as if from rain, but scorched at the edges as though fire had touched skin. They led from the East Tower, down through the North Corridor, and vanished at the threshold of the estate chapel, the same chapel that had not been used for 80 years, the same one where, according to old staff records, Helena was last seen weeping before the altar on the night she vanished. Isabel turned slowly toward Colonel Renshaw, the estate's oldest servant, and one of the few still living who had been present that winter. "You found her locket, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "Not lost, hidden, in the bottom drawer of your study desk." alongside a final entry from her diary, the missing page. Renshaw, who had kept a rigid, unreadable expression all evening, blanched. "She said the mirrors lie," he whispered, "that reflections remember things we try to forget." Isabel lifted the photograph from the mantel, holding it so all could see. In it, Helena smiled beside young Elizabeth Ainsley, barely 10 years old at the time, but behind them, reflected in a tall, ornate mirror, stood a third figure, tall, shadowed, featureless. "The same mirror," Isabel whispered, "now cracked clean down the center, not from impact but from pressure, from inside." Lady Miriam gasped audibly. The mirror above the hearth, twin to the one in the photo, groaned softly, almost imperceptibly, but it groaned. The bell in the chapel rang once, hollow, uncalled, unanswered. No one had pulled its rope, no one had entered the chapel since the last Ainsley funeral. Isabel did not flinch. "You all tried to forget Helena Ashcroft. You locked her story behind stone and silence, but stories don't rot like corpses, they wait, and if left too long, they come back hungry." Her voice was not angry, not vengeful, but it echoed with something unshakable, something old. At that moment, the fire dipped and flared. In the mirror, just for a breath of a second, Helena's eyes appeared, watchful, mournful, but patient. She was not there for vengeance, she was not there for forgiveness, she was there for acknowledgement, for truth. And somewhere deep within the East Tower, behind the red door, a second key turned. The wind curled through the twisted hedges of Elmridge Hollow, like a serpent, cold and heavy with the scent of damp earth, forgotten secrets, and the faintest trace of rusted iron, like blood left too long to dry. They said Marshburn House had slept in silence since the tragedy 15 years ago, its windows shuttered, its chimneys choked with ivy, but Margaret Linton knew better, because the house had blinked. Not literally, of course, but she had seen it, a curtain twitch last Tuesday just after twilight, a flicker of movement where no one should be. And tonight the lights were on, not all, just one, top floor, left side, its glow a warm trembling yellow, not of electricity but of candlelight, as though someone inside feared being seen too clearly, or maybe hoped to be seen by someone specific. Inspector Hargrave stood at the edge of the rusted gate, its iron frame bowing into the earth like a grave marker, his coat flapping gently, as he stared up at the house with an unreadable expression. "It's not just trespassing," he said, his voice deliberately calm but stretched thin. "Whoever's in there, they've been digging." Margaret's throat tightened. She remembered the evidence room back at the station, the cabinet marked Marshburn glowed no public access, and how only 3 people had keys. 2 of them were dead. "It's about the girl," she whispered. "Anya. They said she fell, but the railing." She trailed off. Hargrave didn't respond. His silence wasn't hesitation, it was containment. The house creaked as they stepped inside, the floorboards bending like ribs underfoot, and the air felt oddly thick, compressed as though time had never moved beyond the night. Anya died. Dust clung to every surface, but nothing was broken, nothing vandalized. Everything was preserved, like a mausoleum made of memories. The kitchen still held the smell of lavender polish, but underneath it lay something darker, burnt sugar, scorched cloth, and something faintly metallic. They reached the hallway where Anya had once laughed and fled barefoot after stealing jam from the pantry. And there, along the faded wallpaper between the nursery and the study, 4 words had been traced into the dust, deliberate and chilling. "I never left, Anya." Margaret recoiled. "This wasn't here before," she said. Hargrave stared at the message for a long time before turning toward the attic stairs, which now stood open despite having been padlocked this very morning. "They always said she screamed before she fell," Margaret said, "but no one ever asked who she screamed at." Hargrave's jaw tightened, "And no one saw her mother until hours later," he muttered. The attic air bit like frost, unnatural for June. At its center stood an old pram, veiled in cobwebs. Inside, a scorched porcelain doll, its eyes hollowed out, a lock of real blonde hair sewn into its scalp, and beside it, a silver locket warm to the touch. "It was buried with her," Hargrave said, voice thin. This can't be real." The candle beside the pram flickered violently, once, twice, then died without wind. Margaret turned, breath cold against her skin. "Someone's waking what you tried to keep buried, but this house doesn't forget." Hargrave said nothing. His hand clenched around the locket, and his shoulders stiffened as if a weight decades old had just reattached itself. "You signed off the final report," Margaret said. "You knew she didn't fall, you knew she ran from something, or someone." The attic door groaned as it creaked shut behind them. From the shadows a music box began to play, a fractured lullaby, a melody that skipped, cracked, repeated itself like a child stuttering through a nightmare. "You told the town she lost balance," Margaret whispered, her gaze never leaving him. But it was you who lost control. She saw something. You saw her. Hargrave's mouth moved but no sound came. The candle reignited on its own, casting long, writhing shadows across the beams. I told myself it was mercy, he choked out at last. The family couldn't take another scandal. I thought burying it was better than letting it rot in the open. Margaret shook her head, eyes dark. No truth stays buried, Hargrave. Not if it was never yours to bury. She looked back at the wall where the dust writing now had changed. Below the original message, one more word had been added, as if written by a finger trembling with rage or sorrow. Remember. And in that moment Hargrave knew. The silence he had bought all those years ago was finally spent. Margaret stepped back as the pram began to rock, slow and creaky, as if lulled by a ghost. She never left, Margaret whispered, not unkindly. But you did. You walked away, and now she's walking back. Somewhere below them, a door slammed shut. Outside the wind wailed not with force but with purpose. The past had come home, and it had no intention of leaving quietly ever again. Rustling beneath the ash trees, where light and shadow danced across the ground like forgotten memories, the air carried with it the scent of something old, something unsaid. In the heart of the village, too quiet for innocence and too orderly for truth, Eleanor Blackthorne sat with a cup of cooling tea, her eyes tracing the horizon but focused inward, sifting through whispers that never made it to words. She had returned not for nostalgia, but because the silence had grown restless. A letter misplaced, a lock broken without force, a melody played on an untuned piano. These were not accidents, they were invitations, and she, with her calm gaze and quiet persistence, answered them. The past did not shout, it lingered coiled in the corners of worn wallpaper, waiting to be noticed by someone who understood that guilt does not die, it waits to be recognized. The house at the edge of the woods where ivy strangled the chimney and the windows blinked with tired glass had once been a place of laughter, until that winter evening when the snow fell too fast and a girl's scream vanished beneath it. They said she ran, they said she broke. But no one asked why her shoes were neatly placed at the foot of the stairs, or why the family portrait was missing its glass. Eleanor did, and what she found wasn't a monster hiding in the dark. It was sorrow disguised as survival, a father's trembling hand and a sister who wrote poems with lines scratched out like wounds. When the truth emerged, it did not roar, it wept. A thread of silver hair in the fireplace, a scorched corner of a prayer book, and a jam jar labeled December but filled in July. These were her clues, small things, forgotten things. But the truth is like water, it will find its way through the tiniest crack. And so justice arrived not like a storm but like a breath, returning peace without applause. What remained was not triumph, but understanding that the words we swallow shape our lives more than the ones we speak, and that buried truths do not rot, they ferment. Eleanor walked the garden path one last time, her steps unhurried, her mind still turning, and as the laburnum trees whispered above her, she wondered if the ribbon had never been found, if the diary had remained unopened, would the past have stayed silent? Or would it, like always, have crept back through another forgotten trinket, another whispered name, another story waiting to be seen? Tell me, dear listener, what you believe. Does truth always find its voice? Or do some echoes fade before they are ever heard? Share your thoughts below. Your words may be the final page of someone else's puzzle. If this tale stirred something quiet and curious within you, subscribe for more stories woven with stillness and suspense, and do share it with a friend who finds thrill in what is hidden just beneath the surface. Until next time, keep your lamp low, your ears sharp, and your tea slightly bitter, because in every silence there is always a story waiting to rise.